I also don't have too many topics. We can go over the updates first. Some commit from Tommy about workflow metadata. So this is adding a metadata field to the summary model. A build issue, something on Linux with case sensitivity, fixed by Peter. Some multi-tenancy fixes, specifically in the HTTP endpoint middleware. So this is about multi-tenant use of Elsa. So this was missing. And some wallet changes. Sorry, I had to clear my throat a little bit. So this is Elsa 2, nothing much changed there. I did some light work on Elsa 3, but I've been away for most of the week last week, so not much progress there, but the progress that has been made is pretty cool. Yeah, maybe I'll just show a little bit there. One nice thing that I discovered has to do with the ability to control from an application's point of view what controllers to include. So this is an issue for some users with Elsa 2, and they can fix it. I will show you how. But the problem is when you bring in Elsa libraries, for example, let's take a look at Elsa 2. Here we have this server API which exposes endpoints. If you want to work with a designer, then you do want to have all of these endpoint controllers exposed in your application, but there's also a package in the HTTP activities library which also exposes some endpoints, and some users don't like this. They do want to use the HTTP endpoint activities, but they don't care for these two controllers. And then the question is, how do you exclude these controllers? Because by default, ASP.NET Core, starting with version 3.1, I believe, they will include all controllers that have been from all packages that are referenced by the main application. So there's a way to change that, and I've been experimenting with that in Elsa 3. So let me show an example. So here we have a sample ASP.NET Core application. And then here I go ahead and add controller, so that's MVC services. And then what I do, a clear application part. So this is the key to controller discovery in ASP.NET Core. By default, it will add assembly parts based on the references of the current application. So this will include by default the Elsa API controllers because I'm referencing that package. But by doing this, I will clean out all of these included parts. And then I can build it up from scratch again. So I can add my own controllers if I want to. So in this example, I don't have them, so this call is not necessary, but it would be necessary if you did have controllers in your application or controllers in any other of your own projects. So you will want to add them manually back. And then you can add the Elsa API controllers that you want. So this extension method is just a simple helper. It uses the assembly part to add this current assembly. So in this case, Elsa API as an application part. And we can even do it using a custom part called a types part if you wanted to add one controller from a given assembly, if that's something you would want. So this is nice because this solves the problem of automatically including controllers that you don't want to be exposed through your application. And this allowed me to basically refactor all of these endpoints from what they are called, I forgot the name, but there's this simple way of adding API endpoints that doesn't require to use controllers, but I refactored this to use controllers because this gives me the ability to use all the ASP.NET Core stuff like action filters, model binding. With of course there's a way to do it with these simple API endpoints, but then you don't have support for Swagger generation, for example, not out of the box at least. And now I get all of these capabilities back, so it's more convenient, I think.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So I can see that you're in the services and then you can clear them. Are you planning on making an extension that you, for instance, can clear only the Elsa parts? Because this method, as you use it now, cleans everything. So you have to inject all the things that you actually developed yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And this is up to the application. You don't have to do it like this. You could also choose to exclude just Elsa or any other packages that you don't want, and then you don't have to build it from scratch. So this is, now I'm clearing everything, but you could do it the other way around by just removing the Elsa API controller. That is up to the application, but it would be a good idea, I think, to have an extension method that allows you to just remove the Elsa API controllers. So by default, it would be included, and if you want to opt out, you could invoke that method. That would be a great idea.
Yeah, and even maybe make differences between, for instance, the controllers needed for the designer and the activities.
Yeah. So for example, some endpoints are about executing code or executing workflows, not necessarily used from the designer, and others are, why not?
Okay, cool.
How about the authorization in Elsa? So if, for example, I want to have different authorization for the endpoints to publish the workflows and the endpoints to just view the status of the workflows. So I have some users who can publish workflows, but other users who can just view the status of the execution.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not entirely sure yet, but I've been playing with the thought of annotating these controllers with an authorize attribute like this, and then providing some policy name. And this policy name could be, for example, in this case, list activity descriptors, and workflow definitions would get its own set of policies so that you have fine-grained control over what permissions are required for a user to invoke these endpoints. And then you can control the actual interpretation of these policies from your startup, from your application starting point. So that might be one way to do it. I don't know if it will work good in practice. I have to experiment, but I'm open for suggestions in this area.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea, because that is one of the challenges I can see currently, is that we cannot really segregate either authorized or not authorized. But we need to have some more fine-grained way to give the permissions to users.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think this will be a good way to do it. Maybe we can even use a single Elsa policy, but have some sort of, I don't know, maybe a custom attribute that lets you specify permissions that are required by the user, so that you can have one policy, but then map it to claims where permissions are mapped to a claim. I don't know. We'll do some experimentation to see what works nicely. For those who weren't there last week, and well, you're not able to watch the video yet because it's not published yet, we have the results from the steering committee election. And so these are the top 5 winners. So that means these 5 people are now officially steering committee members, and I still have to create an issue on GitHub to list these people and request for a brief bio, an avatar or a photograph. And then maybe we can put it on the Elsa website. We discussed this last week. So for those who are seeing this for the first time, congratulations, you made it.
Thank you.
Another change for Elsa 3 when compared to Elsa 2 is the way workflow definitions are handled. So in Elsa 2, we have this notion of workflow providers, and one such implementation gets workflows from the database, another one gets it from programmatic workflows that you write in C#, and another one from blob storage, etc. And of course you can extend it. But that implementation is inconvenient, to say the least, when it comes to listing available workflows to the system using pagination, for example. Currently in Elsa 2, if you go to the screen, you have to first select the workflow provider, and then you'll get a list of those workflows for that workflow provider. And just to show you what I mean, let me see if I can start Elsa 2 on my machine. So if you go to Workflow Registry, here you see the 3 providers that come out of the box. So there's the programmatic one, blob storage, and database. And these workflows come from the database. This one is hard-coded in Elsa. But this approach, it's very inconvenient because, one, this is not a great UX. And if you wanted to just list pages of workflows, it's tricky. You can do it, but it's not very straightforward. With Elsa 3, everything gets stored in a database. So your coded workflows loaded from JSON files or from your own backend, or doesn't matter where it comes from. During startup, these workflows are discovered, and then a definition is added to the database. We are already doing this in Elsa 2 just for triggers. And now in Elsa 3, the initial version did the same thing. It was then indexing all of these workflows, get all the triggers. But now it's not just indexing the triggers, it's also loading the workflows into the database. This has 2 big advantages. One, well, what I just mentioned, it's now easy to query pages of workflow definitions. They are all treated the same, but of course they are not the same. Programmatic workflow is not the same as a workflow defined in JSON, but I regard it as an implementation detail. And what that brings me to the second advantage. What we can now do is we can allow the user to publish or unpublish a workflow that's coded in C#. So even though it's hard coded into your application, you can still, if you want to, disable it from using an API call or using the designer if you want to. And it doesn't stop there. You can then also actually use the designer to move activities around. You won't be able to add activities because, well, if it's coded in C#, you can't change that code just like that. In theory, it's possible, but it's not very practical. But at the very least, we could allow the user to change activities around, change variables, like, input variables for the workflow, and maybe change other metadata for this workflow that is then used at runtime by this workflow or in the designer, so that you have visual control over the layout of your workflow. So those are some of the advantages that brings this new approach. So let me show you in the database what that looks like. So here we are looking at a SQLite database, and it shows the workflow definitions. And the way to distinguish the different types of workflows are by looking at the materializer name. So the CLR ones are workflows discovered from source code, and the JSON ones are created using the API or the designer, which uses the API. And it's not completely implemented yet, and by that I mean you can't currently load a CLR workflow into the designer because there's some additional work to be done to make that work properly. And also I need to put in some limits, because even though you should be able to publish and unpublish a coded workflow or CLR workflow, having multiple versions of it, maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. I have to think that through a little bit more. On the one hand, multiple versions might make sense because of the different positions you can apply to individual activities, but maybe it doesn't make sense. I don't know yet. For now, when you do look at the designer, you will only see the JSON one. So I'm putting a hard-coded filter for JSON type workflows when loading the workflow definitions. So here you can load workflow definitions, and these are the ones created by the designer. Last week we talked a little bit about the size of these icons. I made it a little bit smaller. We could go even smaller, but it's already smaller than what you see on the canvas here. So it should be a little bit better. And I added some fancy icons to this one at least. It's not complete yet, but we'll work on that iteratively. Yeah, so I think that's it for the update with Elsa 3. Actually, I forgot about import-export. The import and export API endpoints I finished today. I'm currently working on implementing it in the designer. So for export, that's implemented. So now we can export workflows from the designer, but import isn't done yet. So that's actually what I'm currently working on. Other than that, there's another front-end developer working on some of the tasks for the designer. Maybe you can take a quick look at those. Yeah, so mainly these guys here. But not much progress since last week, because we looked at the same list and nothing has moved except for the name field. That one has been done, which is nice. Has anyone any questions about any of the things we discussed just now?
Yeah, I was thinking about the versioning of CLR, and that's a tricky one actually. Because I don't even think, like you said, it's only for the position or the flow. It might be interesting to have versioning, but you can't guarantee that it works if you update the CLR and have them side by side. That's impossible, I guess.
What do you mean side by side?
Well, that you have the old version of the implementation of some activities or the workflow itself. Because you can update the internal workings of an activity, which basically gives you a new version, but you can't detect that.
Oh, so you're
saying you can't have them side by side.
Well, yeah, if you update a workflow created in code and you didn't create a copy of that code, then there's no way of displaying that side by side.
Yeah.
But there's also another tricky issue. If you do make a change, for example, you add an activity or remove an activity, change connections, then the workflow definition in code may be referencing activities that are no longer there. For the new ones, it's okay, they just don't have a position. But for the ones that have been removed, the designer needs to take that into account as well, or the backend. I don't know. But that's another thing to be aware of for handling this correctly. Another thought I had was if you look at the data column for a workflow, I added a binary data and a data. So in theory, what we could do is compile the workflow builder or the workflow definition in code into an assembly and then store the byte data of that assembly here in this column. And this way you have a version always, even if you make changes to the source code, the system will then see that it has changed because some signature or some hash has changed, and then it will do a new compilation and store that in a second record. But of course it's tricky potentially, because if you delete your database, then you delete all of your assemblies. But of course, you will always have your source code, and the system will just create a new definition from that. That is, I think, technically possible, but there are some caveats there. I think you will have to define your workflow definitions either in a separate folder or in a separate assembly even, or a separate project. But that might be an avenue to pursue as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting path to take. It's also a tricky one, since you have, for instance, dependencies within that compilation on specific versions of an external DLL or package. And how are you going to handle that if you're going to update it later on and you have a different version then? Because in the main assembly you have all the references to the other DLLs. And if you update that, the old ones should expect the old version of that package.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe yet a better way would be to actually take the source code of your C# class and have it compiled at runtime once, or even if it's bytecode, but have that somehow be compiled into your application at runtime without having the dependencies at that point. I don't know how that works.
You could do that. It's possible to execute it, and I was thinking about does that expose then vulnerabilities? Potentially, yes. You could have a package included there in the assembly that you don't want to have running on your server, for instance.
Yeah, but like you say, it's interesting to prototyping, see how far one would get.
Sure. I have some POCs regarding that. It's about writing just script language and compiling it and see if you can reuse that in different applications. So I will look into that and see what I ran into. So we don't have to explore all the paths again.
Yeah, that's great.
For me, what I feel is that if you are going with a programmatic workflow, it is something like a built-in functionality or a business logic-related workflow that you are not intending to change without doing all the checks. So I'm not sure if it is really required to keep the version control for that. Because if it is some workflow that you are trying to evolve over time, then definitely you want to use the designer so that you can let the users, change the workflow and keep the version. But if you are doing it in a programmatic way, I'm not really sure if there is an intention to make it in the same way. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean, but there's also scenarios where you want to use the workflow that's programmatic, but then you have an existing system in production with workflow instances that depend on a certain schema of your workflow. And if you have new requirements and you make changes to that one workflow definition in code, then your existing workflow instances might break because currently at least, there's no way for those workflow instances to upgrade to the newer schema of your updated workflow. So that's another reason you may want versioning, even if you don't care about the old version.
Interchangeable if I want to export the programmatic workflow in a designer version, because this is what I already design it in the designer, it will use the same language. So is it possible to export it and then import it in the designer?
To a certain point. With Elsa 2, it's possible to a certain point, because if you have a programmatic workflow and you use C# lambdas, for example, then they don't translate well to the designer. So the designer would just display some type name of that lambda expression, but not the actual expression. So it wouldn't be able to then, it would not be an actually executable workflow. So the workflow designer can display the activities using the automatic layout algorithm, but that's just a read-only view. If you then would want to actually use that as executable workflow so that you can also version it, that won't work. And with Elsa 3, it's a little bit easier because the model you create programmatically is actually a serializable model, but it has the same problem. If you use C# lambdas, then it won't be executable anymore unless you use JavaScript expressions, because then that gets stored as well in the serialized output. So that would be a way. So you could start out with a programmatic workflow, export it to the designer or to some JSON format using the designer, for example, and then you would have a versionable workflow through the designer. But yeah, it's tricky. And I think for programmatic workflows, probably the most pragmatic way is to just create a multiple version. So create a copy of your workflow definition, and you could use file nesting to have different versions so that it stays a little bit organized in your source code maybe.
Now, when you have an coded workflow, and if you would create an updated version for that, meaning that you have a second workflow, there's no way to correlate them back now. It's going to be two workflows, I guess, not able to say, well, this workflow is the version 2 of that similar workflow.
Well, actually, there is a way to do so, and I will show you.
Okay.
So, for example, let's say we have this workflow. We can say that this workflow has a definition ID. So this is the logical workflow definition ID. So this could be, wow. So this is important for this to be the same for all versions. And then I can say builder.version 1. So this would be version 1. And this class will be called 1, like this. And now I create a new version. And I'll call this one 2. But we will keep the workflow definition to while, but of course increase the version number. So this way, new workflow instances will use this second version, but existing instances will still be referencing this one.
I think that this is the solution that you want for the versioning. So I agree with the comment that was made before, that doesn't make sense, because if you write it in code, you're in control of the code, and you can select yourself how you can select versioning and how, if you want to remove it or replace it, or have it like this side by side, still have the ability to have different versions. It doesn't make that sense, much sense to make it as a source code or a binary or something, because you're already in control of the programmatic ones in the code yourself.
Yeah, that's very true. Of course, it's also easy to make a mistake. It's like I could add an activity here and then deploy to production and then realize that I made a mistake and now all of my workflow instances no longer work, the existing ones. There's also a lot of code that you generate, so that's harder to look at. Of course, if you treat this as an immutable workflow definition, then you only have to look at it but never change it. You would have to create copies, which you can of course get by introducing a good structure, using a folder structure or file nesting. But yeah, I agree that having a binary format, it makes it opaque and hard to troubleshoot, especially if you have older versions and they run in production. Then let's say there's an issue and you want to troubleshoot, there's no way to go back to your older version, unless of course you go back in Git using Git versioning, but it makes it more complicated than having these classes in code readable to you. So
yeah, agree.
And of course, this is the easiest way. It doesn't require fancy compilation and storing it in bytecode or executing code at runtime, etc. Or compiling this at runtime, I mean. Yeah.
This is already in version 2, right?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Another problem solved for me.
That's good to hear. It's always nice to hear. So in Elsa 3, I wonder, we have a 2 in Elsa 3. We have versioning, and we have this. Okay. And if you don't specify a definition or a version defaults to 1 and the definition ID defaults to the type name, just as an FYI. So what's next for Elsa 3? Well, you guys have seen the list. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the front end myself as well. Probably I'll be picking up the toolbar. And then for a customer, they have existing workflows. So I'm going to adapt those workflows to Elsa 3 using the designer. I already did that for the engine as a proof of concept, and that worked pretty well. But of course, the real challenge is having the designer, and as discussed before, the initial version will be similar to Elsa Designer 2 and Elsa Designer 1. It's a little bit of a mix, but the flowchart model remains. But we did discuss about how easy it is to explode your workflow into a huge diagram, because there's no nesting in the designer. And that's what we want for Elsa 3 as an additional type of designer where you have nesting, for example, for sequence. So the diagram we're looking at right now is a flowchart diagram, doesn't have nesting. But let's say we add another flowchart, because a flowchart in Elsa 3 is just another activity. So let's say we now want to execute this flowchart. I imagine the user should be able to, let's say, double click on this one, have another tab open or some trails, some breadcrumb trails with a new designer for this flowchart. And the same goes for sequence, which would have its own designer, where you have a simple top to bottom or left to right sequence of activities, and the if activity has two branches, but you would only add a single activity to it, which itself could be a container activity, like a flowchart, like a sequence. Well, we showed this last time. It would behave similar to Windows Workflow Foundation. That's one of the first things I want to focus on after Elsa 3 is stable and released to the main brands. Also, just as an FYI.
That would be great, and I think it's much needed. I just
For
have
sure.
one small question. For when publishing the workflows in Elsa3, is there a default name given to the workflow? Because one thing that we face in Elsa 2, if you forget to give the name, it will go as an untitled, and sometimes you lose track of the workflow.
I know what you mean. Yeah. So what I thought of doing was to give the name a sequential suffix. So let's say Untitled 1, Untitled 2. The other idea would be to have the name field be required. So initially it's just empty and then it forces you to provide a name. Personally, I'm not a fan of that. I always find it annoying, but this could be a personal preference that could be maybe configured on the web component itself or maybe on the server side. I don't know. Do you have a suggestion maybe of what would be a good solution?
I think while publishing, it may be required to become mandatory to give a name. Otherwise, if you publish multiple workflows and forget to give them the name, they all become as untitled, and then you don't know which one is which. So maybe while working in the workflow, it can remain empty until you are about to publish. Then when you publish, maybe a pop-up will come and make sure that you have a name.
Yeah, that could work. And then maybe when you do a new workflow, maybe it will show pop-up as well, where it prompts you to enter name or not. And then we do it, as you say, as soon as you publish, then either this returns red or a pop-up appears where you are prompted to enter a name. And the default value could still be untitled 1, 2, 3, etc. But then it's more explicit.
Yeah, and I think there was some issues sorting that I don't know. In Elsa 2, it was sometimes random, not by the created time. So if I had a bunch of untitled workflows, then I don't know which one is the latest.
Oh, yeah, I think I've seen that bug.
So if at least they are sorted by the creation time or something, then it will help.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, makes sense. All right, well, that's all I have. Unless there's anything else, then we can wrap up a little bit earlier than normal. All right, guys, thank you for attending, and we'll see you next week. Take it easy.
Thank you. Bye.